There we go. And just say welcome to Emma for today's Emma Lewry and Headteachers, EYFS and School Leadership. So this is another one in our programme of CPD. I think we're doing designing an exceptional learning environments today. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Good. Amazing.
Get that sorted in an hour.
Perfect. Well, in that case, over to you.
Okay, I will share my screen. I hope I will share my screen. Let's see if that's going to work. I hope everyone's okay. Can you see that?
Yeah. Looking good.
Okay,
Perfect.
Good. I can't see you now. I don't know. Sometimes I can see you, but I can't at the moment. Okay. I can't see the chat, Michelle. So if people pop anything in, you're willing to just tell me, and I'm happy to pause. I won't pause sharing as I go through, but hopefully that is fine. So yeah, good afternoon if you're joining me now, or good other part of the day if you're watching another time the recording. I hope you're okay. I hope you had a good start to the year. If you haven't joined before, my name's Emma, and I am early years specialist teacher. Have been a head teacher of 3 schools, and now work as an early years consultant, and I do lots of different projects across the country. So I'm going to get started by sharing. Oh, my screen's not working well. What we're going to look at today. We've done a couple of other sessions before already. This is the 3rd one, and today we're going to be thinking about exceptional learning environments. So we're going to explore something around continuous provision, a little model I use just to understand that terminology a little bit. We're going to dig into that kind of idea of what are we really looking for when we go into environments, or if we're teachers ourselves, what are we trying to create? What do we want it to look like and feel like? We're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the role of the leader and what we can bring. So whether that's coming at this from kind of an early years leader perspective, a head teacher perspective, or middle and senior leadership, because sometimes it can feel, and I know lots of leaders say this to me, if you are not early years kind of specialism or trained, you can feel a little bit like you sit separately and you're a bit unsure about what you can bring and add. Things can feel like a bit of a minefield if the curriculum and pedagogy is very different to maybe some formal teaching that happens in the rest of school. But actually there's a huge amount that another body, another brain, working with early years teams can do, just little ideas that hopefully will be useful for you. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about outdoor environment, because that always comes up. People are saying, what do we do with outside, especially in the gorgeous Great British weather? So I'm just going to give you a moment to think about what we talked about last time and just have a moment to reflect, really, because it feels like a very long time ago when we last met, which I think was end of November. We were looking at kind of effective planning and teaching, really carefully looking at the importance of knowing the skills and the knowledge that we want the children to learn. We were kind of really looking at drilling down into what is it that we want children to learn, and we're going to almost follow on from that today, because we're going to take that depth of thinking around the small steps and the knowledge that we have mapped out for the children, and think about how we can make sure the environment works for us. So we talked a bit about those understanding skills and knowledge. We did look at some images of environments and think about what that would look like if we were being really specific, and then we did a little bit of thinking about planning and practice. So I'll give you a moment to do that. If you want to put anything in the chat about reflections, then please put them in. And I'm just going to see if I can slightly change my sharing so that I can see you, because at the moment I can't. I can just do it slightly differently.
Interesting. We can see you on the bar across the
top.
Okay. As well as seeing your screen.
I think if I do this, it will come up. Oh, maybe not. Can you see that?
I can still see you, and I can still see the screen.
Okay.
You can't see us.
That's all right, as long as you can see me. I just want to, sometimes it's nice to see people's faces. Okay, fab. So yeah, do put anything in the chat that sort of came up from last time. Anyone's got any questions, please put them in. I can't see it though, Michelle, so if you just shout out to me, and then I can answer any of those, and then if not, we will get going. Okay. So this
Nothing
is
in the chat so far. So yeah, off we go.
Yeah, just if anyone wants to chip in as we go along, please do. And if you're watching the recording and you have any questions, I will share. You probably have my email anyway, but I'll share it at the end. And please feel free to just ping me an email. I'm very happy to send ideas and feedback, or just answer questions, or have a chat about things if that's helpful. So we looked at this kind of document. I thought about this last time a little bit when we are thinking about kind of some of the research, the documentation that's out there. Obviously, we've got the new Ofsted framework, which is meaty and huge, and I'm not going to spend time on that today because that sits, you know, slightly separately. Although environment is obviously in there a lot, and how we utilise our environment comes into that. You know, the idea of inspection and what we're going to be able to do when we're showing off our best practice. But when we think about the sort of strong foundations, we're thinking about, and some of these I think come through in our environment. So particularly this third one down, schools do not always allocate enough time for children to practice what they've been taught so that they remember it. Like, our environments can help us with that. Okay, if we kind of prescribe to a Montessori Reggio ideas and theories, they talk about the environment being the third teacher. Okay, and what we want is that the environment, I say, serves us, that we feel like we have set up our environment in a way that when we send our children into it and they are immersed in our environments, that it is delivering and supporting us to absolutely do that, have time to practice opportunities, practice learning, practice knowledge, explore and develop their thinking. So we want the environment to serve us. That top one we talked a little bit about last time, like I said, the skills and knowledge. We need to be really clear about the skills and knowledge that we want the children to gain, and that we set our environments up in a way that, again, serves us so that it really helps them. Okay. When we think a little bit more about kind of gaps in here, it's talking about, you know, weaknesses in children's knowledge, then we can get the environment to help us with that as well. If we know there are gaps in children's knowledge and skills, we can think about what sort of, you know, I don't always use the word activity because it sounds a little bit closed, but, you know, what sort of provocations, what sort of opportunities can we put in our environments? Okay, so everything that we're doing today does link back to lots of ideas in strong foundations and into Ofsted framework, and how we can make sure we are being really effective educators by making sure the environment is kind of an extension of us. So I think it's important, and we have talked about this before, particularly in session 1, to go back and remind ourselves and centre ourselves in this idea of how children learn. And I think this quote is brilliant. I don't know if I shared it in session 1 or not, but for me, this quote just really sums up how children learn. It's so simple, but particularly in early years, this is incredibly evident. We know that children need to be active. Physically, they need to be active in order for their bodies and brains to process learning, for things to go into their long-term memory, that embodied cognition idea. They need to be active, not only physically active, they also need to be you know, cognitively active, like engaged in what they're doing. They need to be interested in it, because that means we'll have better outcomes with them. They need to use language. We know communication language is a focus nationally. It's something that's a challenge for us as schools, but we want to give them opportunities to use language, to develop language, to use language to kind of negotiate and explore new ideas, new subjects, new worlds for them. So language is a really important part of what we want to be going on in the environment. We know that children need to have opportunities to organise their own learning experiences. Now, that might feel that it can be hard to do. Ultimately, what we're saying is children have choice to make decisions within the environment about what they go and explore. Okay, and that choice, there's a lot of research around choice as an idea in terms of autonomy. Children that have choice, ultimately it feeds their motivation, it feeds their engagement, and if they're motivated and engaged in something, they're more likely to focus on it, and they're more likely to focus on it for longer. Okay, and we know that children need to interact with others, peers, educators, their teachers. They need to be interacting, because that is how they learn. You know, there will be some direct instruction going on, but then they need to be able to have opportunities to interact, to you know, ponder their thinking, to ask questions, to mull things over, to hear differences of opinion. The interaction is really important. So I think it's such a simple quote, but for me, it's one to go back to, and one that we need to think about again. Okay, if this is how children learn, and particularly in early years, this needs to be a focus. How much is our environment giving us the opportunity to create these ways of learning? And so I just want to pause and ask you to ponder, pop it in the chat if you can. What to what extent do you feel at the moment your environment is providing opportunities for children to learn in this way? And we're thinking just about early years, I suppose, now, but I would invite you another time, because I do a lot of this work with schools, to look at how your Key Stage 1 and even Key Stage 2 classrooms provide these opportunities as well, because ultimately this is, this is how children, young children, so primary age children, these are the sorts of things they need to do to learn. So just ponder that over for a moment, pop it in the chat if you can, and we will get started on the sort of nitty-gritty then of what we can do in our environments to kind of extend, maximize these things. How can we make sure children have lots of opportunity to be active, cognitively and physically, in a safe way? How can we make sure that they can use language and have opportunities to use and develop language? How much and in what ways can we enable them to have autonomy and choice? And then how much can we enable them to interact with others? Okay, now as everything, and I think environment is particularly this, it's important to root ourselves in our context as well, isn't it? And lots of schools will say, oh, environment's really difficult because our classrooms are really small. Equally, I get people saying, oh, our classroom's really big and unwieldy, it's really hard. Outdoor areas, like I said, are always a challenge. We get money is, that's gone years ago. Money's really hard, so being able to fund engaging, exciting classrooms can feel like a real challenge. It can feel like we can't do that. I hear time and time again, particularly the last year or so, leaders and staff saying really struggling with kind of behaviours that challenge the adults in classrooms. Then we've got catchment of particular SEN, our catchment challenging, or lots of SEN children coming through into reception classrooms, and that is becoming very difficult and challenging. Staffing, whether we have turnover of staff or we have staff who are inexperienced, all of these things can absolutely offer us challenges. In the same way, some of these will be opportunities for you. There'll be things that give you the space to, you might have some really experienced, fantastic early years teams. You maybe be one yourself here joining. And these things we just need to reflect on and think about. And the things that I'm going to share with you today, hopefully, there will be aspects that are useful to think about, whatever your context, but of course you need to filter those to think about what's most useful and to what extent you can implement some of these ideas, or to what extent these are already happening. And I'm sure they are. I'm sure lots of these ideas are already kind of in play in your settings. This is just to share again that kind of quote specifically from the Reggio Emilia approach around that idea of the environment and how important it is. And I think we can't underestimate it. And I want to reassure you that even the smallest classrooms, even the buzziest of children, even the most, complex of spectrum of SEN need and, or very academic children in the classroom, whatever that mix is, even with no money at all, there's lots that we can do and we can consider. You just have to think about it in a different way slightly. So let's just remind ourselves before we get into the specifics that the early years curriculum, I'm sure we have this all in our minds, but let's just remember that we want our environment to be delivering, supporting us to deliver the full range of the national curriculum. Okay, so the early years curriculum, sorry. So we want to make sure that we've got lots of opportunities for communication and language, PSED, and our physical development, those top three, because they are our prime areas. Okay, so if we see our early years curriculum and its most basic, fundamental goal is to make sure that children have met their early learning goals in the prime areas. Those are really going to set them up for success in later subjects as they become in the national curriculum. The gaps within those are really hard to fill. And you will know that from working in schools. If you have got PSED gaps, if you have got communication, language, physical development, growth and fine motor gaps, they're really hard to catch up with in year one because they don't form specifically part of our national curriculum. So we want to be thinking about our environments, working even harder to deliver these objectives and kind of the learning that sits within these areas of the early years framework. Sometimes I found that these are the ones that are less included in our environments. And I think I can understand why that is. It's easy to look at a an activity, an idea, or maybe a creative table or a construction area, and think, okay, I can naturally think that that is going to be about more of an understanding the world idea, or if it's art ideas and expressive art and design. But what I want us to explore today is how the prime areas can be developed and supported by using our environment to serve us. Okay, and then also we want to make sure there are opportunities for our literacy, so our reading and writing, our maths, and our understanding the world, which is our past and present, people and communities, and our expressive art and design, to make sure that we've got lots of opportunities. That's not just our art and our kind of DT, that's also lots of our music, our kind of drama, our opportunity for children to express themselves. Okay. So before we get onto the specifics of environment, I think it's really key to think about this idea of continuous provision. I do a lot of work with schools on this, and I talk a lot about it because I really recognise that we have very mixed viewpoints and very mixed ideas about this idea of continuous provision. The word itself is used a lot, or the phrase itself is used a lot, in the same way that play is, and both are really complex. I mean, play is vast. There are hundreds of different types of play, and and play-based learning is one. Continuous provision is an idea that sits within play-based learning. But we need to be really specific about what it is. Now, obviously, I've got my version of my definition. You may disagree and have a version that works really well in your school. So I'm very open to that. But I want to share with you sort of the thinking that I utilise. Because one key bit that definitely gets missed when we talk about continuous provision is the word continuous. I wrote a little blog about it last week, actually. The idea of continuity. It is so important. Okay, if we are putting activities or resources onto tables per session and then we're taking them away again, that's not continuous provision. That's provision. That's activities, very valuable, very valid. We might think about maths lesson where we're going to teach a little bit and we're going to give just very focused maths opportunities across the classroom. A valid and purposeful way of teaching and learning, but not continuous provision. Okay, because it's not continuous. When we use continuous provision, we are talking about the environment, the provision, the resources that have been put out and are available to children. Now, continuous doesn't mean all day, every day. It doesn't mean open access, but continuity means that those things are available to come back to again and again, to repeat, to deepen, to extend our learning, that children can gain confidence by the fact that those resources are available on an ongoing basis. And I'm sure you'll all have been in the scenario where certain children don't want to go to the group table with the adult because they're worried that that bit of Lego is going to go again and they're not going to see it until next week. So continuity gives us that security of children knowing things are going to be available. It develops confidence because they use things again and again. And then with that again and again, there's that repetition, they're getting that retrieval, they're able to challenge themselves and they get depth. So continuity is really important. I recommend schools work with provision that lasts at least half a term. Okay, and I'm not saying it will stay completely static for half a term. We might slightly enhance it, but realistically, provision needs to be there for a chunk of time for children to get into it. Okay, so continuity is really, really important. Autonomy is an important part that needs to be there. If we are putting out, have access to our classroom, we're telling children where to go or which activities to complete, then again, it's provision. It might be a continuity aspect to it, but it's certainly not high quality provision because children don't have autonomy, and autonomy is so important. We thought about that quote in terms of how children learn and what they have access to. And then the last bit of this model, I call it the CAPH model, mainly because I think it's continuous provision is a bit of a superpower. So the main part, or the last part of it, is provision. Obviously, the provision, the what, is really, really important. And again, that's the bit that can feel like, oh, we don't have the space, we don't have the things. We can work with lots and lots of different challenges, but we have to make sure things are purposeful. Have we thought about what are we putting out, and what, why? What is that there for? If you went into any classroom, if you're the early years lead, or your head teacher or senior leader, going into an early year setting and being able to say, you talk to me about the resources that you've got here, or I'm going to question myself, can I talk about what have I got in this space and why is it here? Why have I chosen these things? That's a valid question. It's sometimes a really difficult question. You know, I work with lots of earlier settings where the art area stays the same for a whole year. And some of those things are really valid. They need to stay in that expressive art and design area. They need to have, you know, pens, pencils, some basic, you know, cutting and sticking resources and tools maybe. But then if we look at why are the stencils here now? Why are the, you know, why are the colouring crayons here rather than pencils? Why are the felt tips here? How have you organised those felt tips? Why have you organised in that way? We get to that depth, we can really start to think about the choices that we're making. So we need purpose. We need to make sure that our provision is personalised. Now, we can personalise in a lot of different ways. We can personalise for area of learning. We can personalise for cohort. We can personalise for age. So if we are, you know, nursery or preschool or reception, we can think about that aspect of personalisation. We can think about personalising for SEND need, for interest. We can think about personalising for, you know, one child, this is something for them, or this is for all. So there's a real range of that. And then, of course, last but not least, it's got to be enticing and engaging and exciting. You know, that might be different, you know, different children are excited by different things. It doesn't have to be all to all, but it needs to look inviting so that children want to go and get involved. A kind of little point, bullet point, star point there is also that engaging doesn't necessarily mean a beautiful, perfect setup. I do have an issue with setup tough trays that are made to look exactly, you know, very beautifully laid out when the children are just going to come along and trash it. So engaging doesn't always have to be Pinterest worthy, beautiful setup. Engaging is about igniting interest, curiosity. You know, is there something there that children want to go and get involved in? So I hope that's useful. Do ping any questions, pop any questions in the chat, and we will make sure we pause in time to have any specific questions about that. So when we're thinking about our environment, obviously we're going to take into consideration that how children learn, to what extent are those things available within our classroom. We want to take into consideration those points I've just shared around the CAPE model. Is there continuity in our environment? Is there autonomy in terms of access? And then does provision meet those 3 points? And when we're thinking about what does it actually look like, we want to make sure that there's intention of planning. So that purpose bit, we're going to see that somewhere in the planning, and all schools will have different planning models. There's many different ways that can work. Is it really clear about the why? You know, do we as early years teachers, do leaders know what is it? Why? What are we teaching? What's our expressive and art and design focus at the moment? What's our communication language focus at the moment? What is it that we're working on with these children in this class? And is that somehow replicated in the planning, in our planning formats? Okay. Organisation cannot be underestimated. The way that our spaces are organised is really important. It needs to be very clear, and that's down to clarity of kind of intention. What is it we're looking for? That doesn't mean activity on a table, but it does mean, you know, for example, if we're looking at a construction area, if what you're talking about with your class at the moment are you know, balance of structures and buildings, maybe you're doing a unit of work about castles or buildings in the UK or bridges, for example, we'd want to see that construction areas are organised in a way that will support children to develop their thinking around that, you know, the fine motor, the gross motor, but also that understanding the world thinking. We might have, you know, prompts or images around there. We're also talking about the sort of tidiness, the access of things, you know, provision that is clearly stored, clearly organised. Children can tidy it away by themselves. Nobody wants to be tidying up at the end of the day. So we want, you know, well-labelled resources. Images are going to be really good for young children if they don't yet have the reading skills, either widget symbols or actual picture of the resources, pictures of what does tidy look like, those sorts of things. So that it's very clear what the children can access. That's going to make things feel a lot easier to move through our day. And then, as I said, that, you know, that getting those CAPE ideas in there. And we really want that why behind everything. I think, like I said, a very valid conversation point or reflection point yourself if you're in early years is to say, look at any piece of environment or any zone or space in the classroom and say, why that? And why now? You know, because there's another key point I'm thinking about. Well, why does it look like that now? Will it look like that for the whole year? might need to. It might be really appropriate that those resources stay the same for the whole year. Lots of people have very effective home corners that rightly so stay the same for the whole year to give children lots of opportunity to develop their communication language, PSED skills, understanding word another. But also there might be other things, a bit like the art idea I shared, that need to shift and change as we go throughout the year. Our expectations are going to increase, what we want children to explore, developing their cultural capital. We want to incrementally, offer more challenge and a breadth of experience as we go across the year. So why have we done that there, and why now is a useful question to ask. So what I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about now is I'm going to dig into the provision bits of that CAPE model and just talk about what might that look like, and show a couple of examples, and think also about a leadership perspective on that. So hopefully that will be helpful. Please, as I said, pop any questions in the chat as we go along. So when we think about the purpose, and we did lots of work on skills and knowledge, so I'm not going to repeat that, that's in last session. But we want to think about what are the skills, what are the knowledge we want children to encounter. Now, we might want things to be very open in terms of lots of opportunity, but we as adults want to be very clear about what they might encounter and what we can support them to move forward with. We've talked just now about, organisation of space and furniture. When we think about purpose, is it really clear for the children? Did they, would they know what sort of learning you want? Like that building idea, would they be able to say to an adult, oh, we're doing our construction, but we're thinking about bridges at the moment in our class. So we're going to try and build a bridge between that city and that city that we've made over there. Is that something that the children will be able to do? And if not, what clues could we give them? What images could we put up? What prompts could we use to support them? What other resources might they need in order to help them to develop that thinking? They might do other things as well. They might want to, create a whole farmyard and organise what that looks like. But if they also know that bridges is something we've been thinking about, it's there, and they might be more willing to have a go at thinking about those. Okay. Clear for adults means not just people coming into the room in terms of sort of inspection, but is it clear? Because when we think about particularly support staff, it's a lot to hold in our heads. Sometimes for teachers, we go, I know working on that in communication language, I know we're doing that in expressive art and design, I know we're doing that in literacy. But what about for other adults? Are there prompts around a zone or a space? I really like having planning, very small bits of planning on display in a zone, so that adults can just check and think about, what are we trying to think about here? What am I trying to move the children forward with, so that they can do that? I can't keep it all in my head. Maybe it's my age, but I know I couldn't do before. So having a think about, is it clear for adults, and what structures could we use to just put things? And we don't want reams of planning on the wall. We don't want lots of other, things that are going to be difficult to look at. But is there just a few bullet points, ideas that would be helpful for them to remind them? Making sure that, well, like we said, it's very linked to the curriculum in terms of the early years, focus and those outcomes. What are we doing? Why are we doing it now? And why for these children? So when we're thinking about a leadership lens for that, just some ideas that might be useful. If you are working in early years, then you might be able to do some of these. For some of these, you almost need to invite someone else to come and help you with this. So I think what's really useful is that external viewpoint. If you are a leader, being able to go into the classroom and having non-judgmental, open, professional conversations with colleagues around that why and why now idea. Like, talk to me about the purpose. Why have you put those things there? From a genuine place of interest, not a judgment place of, well, I don't know if that's right. Early years teachers will and do think with such depth about what they are choosing to put in their spaces and why it's there, that just making 10-15 minutes to go and have a conversation about that is usually incredibly eye-opening. The amount of conversations I've had with teams, one stands out really to me around the idea of communication language. And I had this teacher, she was running a really big nursery setting. It had like 3 or 4 different kind of zones of classes, but they were all working together. And they've noticed, as many of us have, that communication language is a real challenge and negotiation was a problem. Now, instead of shying away from that, when I went into the setting, I just sort of thought that some of the ways that things have been organised were a little bit squished. I thought, this is really interesting. Anyway, we got into conversation about it, and they were saying, well, we've really noticed that children are not not playing with each other very much. They're playing quite separately. When they do try and play, there's quite a lot of negotiation challenges. and they're not necessarily choosing to talk to each other lots when we want to. So they'd literally created kind of a perfect storm in this environment where they'd made spaces where children were going to bump into each other. They'd made very narrow, not everywhere, but narrow walkways. They'd made sort of physical development obstacle courses outside where children were going to bump into each other. They'd put kind of tunnels in areas where children were going to naturally meet each other and need to negotiate. They'd really reduced some of the resources in some of the areas so that children had to figure out who's going to use which bits at what time. And then they'd put lots of things facing each other. So lots of tables, rather than maybe like a big group work table, a smaller one with chairs on either side, or workspaces if children are standing on either side. Things like mud kitchens or play kitchens or role play, where there was lots of opportunity to meet, you know, cafes, things where people are doing things across the space. So that real depth of thinking was there. It needed, you know, that conversation needed to be there. So having that external viewpoint and those staff discussions, and just being able to go in and watch. How do children engage? What are they doing? Can I see that purpose coming through? Is it clear to us as an external viewpoint? And then discussions with children are really helpful. You know, can children articulate in their own way, particularly if we're working with young children? They might not be able to say to you, absolutely, this is the learning objective that we are focusing on today in our expressive art and design area. But hopefully they're going to be able to use some language around the knowledge and skills. You know, we're looking at colour mixing, or we're talking about this artist, or we're thinking about holding our paintbrush properly. You know, children should, if we are teaching them and being very overt with the what and what we want to see them engaging in the environment, they should be able to talk to us about that. And then just that broader picture of, are we enabling those conversations with our wider subject leaders? You know, so are those things that we can do? And sometimes that's about, you know, freeing up time and space for people to go and explore what it looks like in early years and what the purpose of the way our environment has been set up, what it looks like. So that's a real deep dive on purpose. And I'm just going to share a few images with you to think about, I guess, purpose of organisation. So this top image is where teachers have organised their, you know, very specifically organised their colours, for example. Now, this wasn't just done because the teacher likes things, well, they do, like things in colour coordination, but what they had noticed was children were just sort of, you know, a bit of a free-for-all with their colouring and drawing, and they wanted to enable children and prompt them and challenge them to be really specific. And what is, you know, very simple way of doing it, organising the colours in that way, meant children had to go and they couldn't just take a pot, they had to go and choose the colours that they wanted, take them away, and then go and put them back. You know, even from a very basic colour matching, they've got to know, you know the colours where they go. Also enable children to have lots of conversations about all the different kind of shades that were in those pots, those ideas. That's a, you know, one little example. We've got the construction area, which uses shadowing, which is where we have the dark kind of spot or shape of the piece there. And when children tidy them away, they have to put them on the shapes. Now, some people will go to the depths of changing the way they tidy up depending on what they're working on with the children. So this really lends itself to discussion about shape, space, you know, how big things are, how small things are, balance, what things look like, 2D shape, 3D shape conversations. So we can organize things in a way that when we put them away, we have to tidy up, they are delivering some of that kind of recapping of our learning all the time. Some people like put numbers on them or do things so that we can see what's missing, but also, you know, there might be orders about things as well. That one at the bottom is organising all of the kind of different arts and crafts things, again, just in a way that's like lots of different things that children are able to have conversations. It's also quite engaging, I think, when things are in a little kind of pot like that. You're thinking, oh, I can't wait to get involved in that little mini fishbowl and see what's in there. This is just to highlight that kind of idea that I talked about with the communication language. So the mud kitchen that is against the wall, you're going to get children standing facing a wall for that one. Whereas this other one, well, there is a little bit of wall. I mean, you might move it right out into the centre would be even better. But actually what that's got is the cross space where children are going to see each other and need to talk and negotiate there as well. We'll talk a bit more about eye in a moment. I shared this idea, kind of signals and prompts. What things have we got around the space that signal to children the sorts of learning that we are looking for? So it might be, like I said, labels. This one's got stories and characters. That's from the image we had at the start, that children were retelling stories and making up their own stories. The initial story they did was the Three Billy Goats Gruff, and they were doing bridges and telling that story. But actually, if they've got story characters, they could choose their own and innovate their own ideas. Is it clear? Are there questions? They might be closed questions, or they might be open. I wonder what seeds, or if I wonder what the first seed was, I wonder which is the biggest seed. We can have kind of pondering questions there to help us. Texts are really important. And then this display board was actually really tiny in a classroom. It was next to their creative area, and it was just modelling the sorts of kind of joins and ideas that some of the class have been looking at in their expressive art and design, and it's helping them to use some of that language and prompting them to remember, or if things won't, could I use a fringe around the bottom of my cone? That might make it easier to stick. Those sorts of ideas. It's not necessarily a beautiful display that everyone else needs to look at. It's a prompt. It's been put there as a prompt for children. And then text rich. It's the year of reading, but for so many schools, we've been talking about reading, love of reading, reading everywhere. For me, when we talk about text rich and language rich classrooms, the most simple and effective thing we can do is put books everywhere. That is going to be far more effective than laminated words. Laminated words, children will mostly just ignore them. But text and books everywhere is something that is really powerful, and I recommend all schools try and do it. I recognise sometimes budgets are tricky, but for example, you will see even in the construction area, for example, either stories, children's stories about books or non-fiction text, but also think a bit bigger about that. Think about kind of what I call coffee table books, books that have got all those pictures of all the bridges in America in these beautiful big double page spreads. Those kind of books are fascinating to children. And when we talk about text rich as well, we're not always saying word rich. Text rich is a way of engaging children in talking and thinking. So books can, that kind of awe and wonder can lead to lots of really great conversation. Oh my gosh, what's that book? Oh, I think what's that bridge? Oh, I think that's in London. I think I've been to that bridge. Fantastic. We can have all of those conversations. Okay. And then just books around our other spaces, either narratives or non-fiction. And often, I don't know, even things like dictionaries and thesaurus, we might be thinking, oh, well, children might not have the language and reading skills yet to access all of those. That doesn't mean we don't want them to be within their environment and part of what they, can see is normal. We can model to them, we can look, they can be interested in looking at the layout and the organisation and the images that are in lots of books as well. So I would definitely always suggest put text in every single space in your classroom that you can. You just need to invest in some little book holders if they are going to fall over quite a lot. Okay, the last one that we're going to get into, and then we'll have some time for a bit more time for sort of discussion and thinking, is this idea of personalised. Okay, so as I said, personalised can mean a lot of different things, but in one sense, we can definitely think about to what extent does our environment support the SEND needs in our class, and we will all have them to varying degrees. Lots of people now, we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50% of children in our classrooms that have need. If you are in that scenario where you have a lot, or if you are in a scenario where you have one or two children, but whose needs are significant, and whose needs are maybe causing quite a lot of challenge within your classrooms, a little activity that I invite you to do is to ask the question of the team and have a really open conversation about this. It's quite a hard one. What would your classroom look like if those were the only children you were teaching? Okay, what would it look like if you had free reign? And sometimes, they'll make quite radical I'd take everything out. I'd only have that. I'd do it in this way. I'd make it calmer. I would, have less. Things might be quite different. And then it is very likely you're not going to be able to completely fulfill that. But then I would invite you to have the conversation about, well, to what extent could we step forward with some of those ideas? How much could we think about the needs of those children? Because actually, particularly if we're talking about behaviours that challenge the adults, if you can minimise that and those children can feel safer, calmer, more grounded in the classroom environment, that will have a really big knock-on effect on the other. Okay, so I find often when we think about particular SEND needs, we sometimes end up adding extra little zones. We have a little zone for that person, a little zone for that gorgeous little individual. We have another little zone for that amazing little person. And that actually creates more, a smaller space, more chaotic. Whereas if we sort of think about starting from a different place, how could we create it to meet as much need as we can? And then we add in the other bits that fit around it. That can be maybe a different perspective. We think about our personalized, we can think about, like I said, what learning objectives are we thinking about? What skills and knowledge? What are a cohort like? What are their interests? And in lots of ways, we want things to be open-ended, because when things are open-ended, we ourselves can then personalize them. We can, if we've got lots of things like loose parts, that can go in any direction that we choose. Things like sort of construction and open-ended craft spaces, children can take those in lots of different ways. And the joy of early years is often that we can facilitate and dip in and take them in lots of different directions. We know that children will have specific gaps and strengths and their own interests. So when we think about that kind of, why have we chosen these resources, why have we chosen to organise our space in this way, we want to be talking about how is it personalised for those ideas. And when we think about role of the adult in this, in terms of a leader, again, just doing observations is a word I don't like to use all the time, but I don't mean that kind of formal observation. I just mean being in and watching. What's going on, what's happening, what do children love, what are they really drawn to, what do they say they enjoy, what is difficult for them, and then obviously resourcing is going to be an aspect. Now, we might not be talking about buying new resources, we might be talking about making an Amazon wish list. These are the things we need to enable to personalize our curriculum better. Pop an Amazon wish list, see if any of our families are able to support and fulfill that, send it to local businesses, see if they're willing to help out. Put out wish lists for 3 things: loose parts areas, and lots of our role play can be invited things in from home. We know we're always going to get the things you don't want from home, they have to go off to the tip. But opening our doors and giving a wish list of things can be really, really helpful. And just sometimes that help with resourcing, it can feel really heavy as an early years teacher, trying to constantly resource our spaces, make sure that the provision is of really high quality. And sometimes someone just saying, oh, what do you need next term, what's coming up, should we put a shout out to parents or staff, new staff who've had children themselves and are clearing out things, or have interest, maybe they can go off and gather things for our loose part zone. That can really be helpful to share the load as well. And the last thing then to talk about is engagement, and how do we do that? How do we make it engaging? So these are actually pictures of my own children. I just share them because I have loads of loose parts in our house. But when they were little, they're bigger than this now, we would get them out a lot on the weekend, especially on a rainy day, of which we've had many recently. And my youngest, I think, was about 2 in this picture, and they started just by putting a few little bits on those little bits of grass. It ended up being a garden, I think. That second picture, I think, was about 2 or 3 hours later. Now, they didn't just do it for 2 or 3 hours. I mean, she was 2 years old, she probably had a nap in the middle, but they just kept coming back to it. And so when we talk about engagement, I think what's really useful for us to think about is the engagement in the moment. How engaged are children in the thing that they're doing, but also how engaged over time are they with things, and is our environment offering them opportunities to come back to? So that might be starting a piece of construction and it's allowed to stay there, and it will be sort of protected in some way. Maybe they need to label it hands off. Can they come back to it? Can they carry on? Is there a way that their art creations or their work outside with the obstacle course, or the bit of writing that they've been doing, or the maths exploration, can those things be saved so that they then come back? Because as we do with other year groups, we can get into a bit of a one and done scenario of early years where we tidy away, we tidy away, we tidy away. And actually often that can be a real barrier to engagement, because children don't want to start from scratch again. And in the same way that we will work on things, we might do a bit and then we have a little break, we might want to go back to it, or we might not want to go back to it, and that's fine, we want to stop doing that project. I think sometimes we need to think about engagement a bit more long term with that. So how is our environment set up to support children to do that coming back, that revisiting? Okay. And in that scenario, when that happens, when we expand that, we do often have more opportunity for, other children to come in and other resources, and we can play a big role in that. I've seen so many amazing early years scenarios where things have snowballed. So they started by one little construction being made in the construction area, that the teachers maybe said, oh, this is incredible, and some other children might have heard about it and come over, and then it's been saved and kept because it's so vital and important. And then because that's been saved, other children the next day want to come and come again and come again. And not long ago, I was in the school in Coventry that I do a lot of work in, and one child, this was actually in their nursery classroom, had started a bit of construction like this, and it had gone on for the whole week. By Friday, he and his friends and lots of other peers had used every single bit of construction and loose parts in the whole classroom, and it become this incredibly complex kind of city with all these different parts to it. So, but that had brought with it real depth of learning. So sometimes that longer engagement is useful to think about. And then when I've put deep focus, our environment can help us with that. Utilizing furniture even just to make kind of slightly more zoned off spaces where children can get in. We live in such a busy world with distractions, and if you notice in your earliest classroom, children sort of not staying focused on something for long, or zipping around, or maybe in certain areas things are getting crushed and bumped into, and that's meaning children can't get that deep focus, is we don't want to block everything off and make it as kind of walls, but even just with low level furniture, creating little zones and spaces that can really help. Children can kind of get down into that space, and they're less likely to look around. I've done lots of work with classrooms where at the start all of their provision is kind of around the edge, and it can kind of lively and busy. And then if you just create a few corners with some furniture, it really calms things down. And if you've got some runners, let's be honest, they're normally boys. And when I say runners, I mean children that like to run around. If they have to navigate more furniture in the classroom, they're less likely to do that, and they're more likely to get engaged. So from a leadership perspective, here is sort of some tips about what might be useful. I think having that external viewpoint is really useful. So, in agreement with class teachers, or maybe freeing them up to do some of this work, being an extra body in the classroom to enable some looking at what's going on. There's kind of 2-minute observations. We used to do long and short observations a long time ago in early years, and not because we're trying to sort of gather evidence necessarily of a specific child, but we want a little bit of insight into engagement. What are we noticing across the classroom? I like to just use like a little tally chart like I've got here at the bottom. Which zones are in play in the classroom, which are available, how many visitors do they have across a 20-minute slot, a half an hour slot, a day slot? What does that look like? Because that can help us to see where the engagement is. And, and when they visit, are they visiting for a long time, or are they flitting? That can give us some clues, a bit of reflection point. Leuven scales are really useful, so I'm really happy to send over this document. It's sort of a rejig of the Leuven scales, which when we're thinking about wellbeing involvement, we know that if children are happy and feel safe, they're going to be able to attend to their learning better, and their involvement, if they're engaged, they're going to get better outcomes because they're focusing for longer. So this is just a really simple grid which gives us some key points to look for, and again, either enabling teachers or support staff to just track a few children or whole cohorts. Some schools do that now, track their cohorts in terms of the wellbeing and involvement scores, and just see where that sits, because again, that will give us some clues to certain children, what's a challenge for them, but also find spaces within the classroom that are working really well. Okay. Oh, we've been through lots. I'll just quickly talk about inside versus outside, and then we'll pause for some questions. So my biggest tip for outside is try and keep outside. Try and keep outside for the sorts of things that can only be outside. Okay, depending on how much space you've got. Sometimes indoors is tiny, we need to expand out a little bit. By that, I'm not saying we're not going to have the learning that's happening on inside. We want to expand and make sure that all of our kind of skills and knowledge are being worked on outside, but think about the sorts of experiences that we can have outside that we can't have inside. So this really simple idea of a tough spot, we could use it to have a very closed maths activity in it, Or we could utilize it for big, messy, might not look very tidy, but play where children are using their gross motor, their shoulder, they're mixing and stirring, they're going to be getting that sensory experience, they're going to be talking a lot because they've got to share all the resources. You know, what's more beneficial for outside? It's going to be the messy stuff, isn't it? And for me, outside really lends itself to any of our messy play. Big gross motor stuff is going to fit really well outside. And that's not just bikes and trikes, you know, that's obstacle courses, den building, our kind of what we might clarify some of our PE type resources, just getting those out and being able to explore them. And then also our knowledge and understanding aspects of the world. So, you know, growing things in the garden, animals, small world, you know, the kind of seasons idea of noticing what's outside. Those things lend themselves really well. So even if you've got a really small outside area, just make it work around those ideas, that understanding the world and outside and the messy, because those are going to be things that you can do really well outside. I also think if you've got big outside areas, sometimes it's worth considering closing them off a bit. So it's not, sometimes outside can feel really unwieldy. We don't know what to do. This is just trying to think about what is it they want children to work on and where can they have those opportunities and how can outside serve us. Okay. Those ideas like physical development, understanding the world, that messy, and the PSAD as well. You know, you've got lots of opportunities to be outside, be louder, and we can let it all out, and those sorts of things are useful. That idea that I talked about with that class that had wanted communication language and kind of negotiation to happen, they'd mirrored that outside. Like I said, lots of sort of tunnels and places where children were going to meet a lot. Something that can be really important is that heavy lifting, lots of, like I said, wheelbarrows, tires. We know that children's core and kind of shoulder strength is not as developed as it was many years ago. They're not outside climbing trees at the weekend. They're not doing those things. So we need to give them those opportunities. You know, bikes and trikes and climbing equipment's great, but we can do lots of other things that don't involve those more expensive resources. And also things like crawling. So we're also seeing a real decline in children, or, you know, some children have always done this, but we're certainly seeing a bit of an issue. Some children are missing that crawling phase. And we know there's links between missing that crawling phase and not particular additional needs, but also that shoulder strength as well that's coming through. So lots of opportunity for crawling, tunnels, going under and through things. Den building is also a really valuable bit to think about within our outside areas. I feel like that's a bit of a whistle stop tour. I hope that was okay. I'm just going to pause because we have got a little bit of time now, which is good, just to think about any questions, curiosities, things that you're pondering. I will stop sharing in a moment so that people can unmute or just add things into the chat and we can have a conversation. Just give you a moment to think about that, and I will just share some suggestions of things that might be useful to do. You know, if you're thinking, right, yeah, there's a lot there. One thing that you can do is just go and have a look around your space and reflect on it through these lenses. Where's the purpose? Where's the personalization, and where's the engagement, and to what extent? And have those conversations with staff. And if you are the early years lead, you know, invite another teacher in to help you reflect on it. You know, say, I think this space, you know, is working really well for this, and this is the purpose. Like, can you see that? Can you come in? Can you look at when the children are here? You know, is that explicit enough? Not for other people just to look at separately, but articulating it. Is it making sense? Does it work? And then that discussion, you know, the why this and why now, why have I chosen this and why now, and reflecting on that a bit ourselves. I think sometimes we can keep a lot of resources in our classrooms that maybe don't serve us as much. Maybe they are things that we, you know, I had a whole conversation about stencils the other day with a school, and they were like, they're just always here, but they don't really do any great work with them. Sometimes they're great and purposeful and valuable. Sometimes hide them and get the children, you know, to be drawing in a different way. Okay, so there's my email. If you wanted to ping me a message about anything, then please do. And again, if you're watching this on like the recording, then I'm really happy to answer any questions that way. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm just going to pop in, Emma, and just give the next few dates and say thank you, and then I'll turn the recording off for questions and answers. So next date, 16th of March, followed by the 18th and the 18th of May and 29th of June. But thank you so much. I think it was just just listening to those different learning environments, then in the flexibility, the layouts, the planning, the approaches, yeah. And then just thinking about, going back to that CAPE moment at the front where you've got that continuity and then almost at the end, that level of engagement and that continuity reflecting in engagement and progression. So thank you so much for today. I'm just going to turn the recording off, but we'll see everybody on the 16th of March.